Hi there, welcome to another video from the Vickers MG Collectional Research Association, and this is another video about our How Let Loose series, so looking at the guns from that game in the British faction. And I'm joined again by Matt Moss from the Armourer's Bench. So we're going to look at the anti-tank weapons, and we're going to look at the platoon level anti-tank weapons, because that's what they have in the British faction. It's all at that level or below. But it must be sort of borne in mind that this wasn't the only anti-tank weapons that the British Army had. Even early on, you had 25mm Hotchkiss, you had 2-pounder light anti-tank gun, or the 2-pounder anti-tank gun, a battalion level, and they were really effective weapons. They were, remarkably, and you've done some stuff on the 2-pounder.
Yeah, and
before.
the 6. There's actually a 6 in the game as well.
Okay, oh, brilliant. Shows how much I know about the game, doesn't it? But yeah, so 6 in the game. And then later on in the war, when we start to look at heavier armour penetration and stuff like that, there's the 17-pounder as well, which will just do everything for everybody. We've got the boys in the game. Now, the boys anti-tank rifle was developed in the 1930s as part of the mechanisation process. And if you want to read more about that, then sign up to our Patreon pages where all of the Small Arms Committee minutes, the trials reports and everything are there. And one of those things is actually how it got its name. So it was originally to be called the Stanchion, S-T-A-N-C-H-I-O-N rifle. But there was a chap called Major Boys that was involved in the development of it. And he passed away during that development, and the committee said, in honour of that, we're going to name this rifle after you. So it became the Boys. And it became the Boys without an E. It's B-O-Y-S. It's named after an individual that did not have an E in his name. So we don't quite know where that came from, that it often gets referred to as the Boys with an E. So if you do know where that came from, let us know, actually, in the comments. That'd be great. But yeah, it's a 5-round magazine of .55 ammunition. And this would penetrate armour quite easily at the start of the Second World War, because armour develops and outstrips the anti-armour capability. And it's certainly, this kind of size round was developed in the 20s and 30s to counter the armour developments. Anti-tank rifles had only come about in the Great War. So they're at the end of the Great War, obviously, with tanks. They hadn't been needed before tanks arrive. And it's the Germans that developed them first, if I remember rightly.
That's right, with the Tigerwehr, which was a similar sort of thing. It's a bolt-action rifle, but a single shot. So this one has a magazine of 5 rounds, which when loaded weighs about 3 pounds. So that's quite a lot of weight to carry around.
Some weight in
that,
yeah.
So they come in a charger clip of 5 rounds, and when loaded, that's 3 pounds. It's a 930 grain bullet with a tungsten core.
Okay, yeah, we've got a core actually. So this is the bit that goes into the armour.
Yeah, as you mentioned there, it can penetrate armour about just under an inch, about 0.9 inches, at about 100 yards, and then it's got an effective range out to about 500, I think.
Yeah, this example we've got here is a firing example. Let's say we have access to those, and if you don't know why and how we have access, then go and watch our video on how we own machine guns and different firearms in the UK. But this one's got a simplified backside. This one, although it is a Mark I, it has had some of the later modifications that came into service. So it comes into service in the 1930s. It is there as a platoon level. So it's not a section level weapon, it's platoon level. And you would have one person, it'd be carried on the platoon truck. So your infantry would mostly be marching along, and then there'd be a 1,500 weight truck, normally with the platoon sergeant, maybe the platoon commander in that as well. And this would be part of their kit that they would deploy when tanks were suspected. Be given to a trained person, but everybody was trained on how to use it. So that's really accurate in the game, in that you can just grab it from your arsenal. Everybody would be trained in how to use it in the same way that they would the Bren gun. And you'd have a box of ammunition, and you'd go out and hit tanks.
There's actually a really good training film which was made by the Disney Corporation for the Canadian Army called Stop That Tank, which came out in 1942, and that is all about how to employ the boys in the proper way. It talks about where to aim on various different types of tank and vehicle for most effectiveness.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. It's effectiveness, isn't it? Because it gets a bad rep. The bad reputation on the boys anti-tank, because by 1942, it's started to be really ineffective.
Yeah.
That inch at 100 yards. We're fighting in North Africa where ranges are longer than 100 yards, and armour is starting to get thicker than the 0.74 inches that
there's a definite limit to what one of those can do, because it's kinetic energy rather than like a chemical heat warhead that's going to punch through armor. So it's a completely different beast. So armor kind of outstrips what a kinetic, anti-tank rifle can do, because we're getting sloped armor, we're getting thicker armor.
And I think there was something, and people, we'd need to do a bit more research about it, and we'll do more research on the boys anyway, because one of the things that we will do, similar to our rangefinder training videos, is we will replicate the small arms training manuals for the boys anti-tank rifle at some point, every lesson by lesson in kit, first person stuff. It seemed to be quite well liked. So we'll do some more of that. But one of the things that I recall from the work that I did for the small arms school corps history was down at Hythe in late 1940. There'd been problems with these in armour penetration in not only Dunkirk, Northwest Europe, 1940, but also Norway. There were concerns about some of this stuff because the commandos had been using them. And it was one quartermaster sergeant instructor's job at Hythe to demonstrate armour penetration of the boys. And the account, if I remember rightly, sort of says that it wasn't the recoil that got him in the end. It was listening, it was the hearing that tungsten core hitting steel plate so many times a day that just upset his hearing rather than the recoil of the rifle. So it is noted, it is a big round, it's much more recoil than 303, but it's also much bigger blast, much bigger noise as well.
Yeah, and that's one thing the game kind of falls down on. So the depiction of it in the game is great in that it's shown being fired from the prone position rather than running and gunning from the shoulder, which would be very difficult, but I'm sure someone gave it a go at some point. And one of the things that the game kind of falls down a bit with is the blast effect that you get from firing one of these, because it's significant, and the recoil that is shown on the character probably could be tweaked a little bit, I think.
Okay. How was it used? You had, as Matt mentioned, these 5 rounds on a charger, but they don't. It's a stripper clip more than a charger actually, because they won't actually load like that. So, well, certainly not in this case. So you put 1 round in there like that, magazine on, and there's a safety catch on the side here, and it cocks on open, which if you watched our rifles videos, we said that the pattern 1914 did that. It didn't. Oops, sorry. There's a correction note on that video if you want to go and find it. But this one does cock on open. Bolt back, bolt forward, quite a strong action down, fire it. To fire it, hand into the back there, and we're going to pull it in, get our cheek nice and low. It's actually quite difficult to get quite a low cheek sight picture on here. We're going to pick it up. That's stupidly heavy, so we're not going to fire it from the shoulder. Definitely be firing backwards there. Fire off the action and get the round out like so. And then it doesn't close on a empty magazine, so we need to take the magazine off, which is in the game and is quite accurate. They change magazines with the bolt open. I'm going to close it forward like that as well. Pressing the trigger so we fire off the action, and then we can put it back on safe.
Loading and firing. This is the magazine, which holds 5 rounds of armor-piercing ammunition. The magazine is loaded by holding it firmly and pressing down on the platform while inserting the cartridges face first. The magazine spring is depressed as the cartridges fill the magazine. Here we see the operations of firing. With the magic of X-ray animation, let us see what takes place inside the rifle when operated. When the bolt lever is raised, the cocking piece and striker is cocked, compressing the striker spring. As the bolt is pulled back, the magazine spring forces a cartridge down. The bolt going forward pushes the cartridge into the breech. As the bolt lever turns down, the bolt locking lugs go into slots in the rifle body, thus locking the bolt firmly in position. The cocking piece is held in check by contact with the sear. When the trigger is squeezed, it depresses the sear, releasing the cocking piece and striker. The striker explodes the powder charge. As the bolt is withdrawn, the extractor pulls the empty cartridge case from the breech. As the ejector comes in contact with the ejector stop, it ejects the empty cartridge from the rifle. The magazine spring forces another cartridge into place. The bolt, going forward, pushes the cartridge into the breech. Turning the bolt lever down locks the bolt, and the rifle is again ready to fire.
So this is a Mark 1 rifle, which has been upgraded or adapted later on. It's got the simplified aperture sight and also has a completely different muzzle device at the end of the rifle from the one in the game, which has the earlier sort of circular muzzle baffle.
Loading and firing practice with dummy ammunition. Take the lying load position. Raise the rifle to the shoulder. Push the safety catch forward. Place the magazine in the rifle. Open and close the bolt. Apply the safety catch. Adjust the sight to the required range. Turn safety catch forward. Take aim and fire. Continue until all 5 rounds have been fired. Notice that the bolt cannot be pushed forward after the 5th round has been fired and ejected. Remove the empty magazine. Push the bolt forward, open and close the bolt, press the trigger, and apply the safety catch.
So it went through some iterations before it came out of service, and yeah, there's even a version with a shorter barrel. So they stayed in service right into 1944 before they were replaced, and arguably there's some that will have ended up in service after that as well. They become really good, like anti-material, as we would call it now, rifles. The later versions of the manuals start to talk about how much brick or stone or gravel it will penetrate, and clearly they still have a role. When other anti-tank weapons are taken over. I think it's the Mark III they end up with. They are, it's a safe lot of ammunition. So actually in terms of airborne forces, rather than dropping high explosive bombs all the time, rather than having to prime and fuse those bombs, these are ready to go. So it does have some longevity.
There are photographs of them in use in Normandy with some of the commando units.
Yep.
In fact, there's a great photograph with both a boys and what replaced it, the PIAT, in the same photo.
And they're used over in the Far East quite extensively as well. And certainly they're quite effective over there because the Japanese armour is a lot thinner.
Yeah.
Aiming. In taking aim, the back sight is adjusted to the required range. The tip of the foresight is brought into the center of the back sight. Target approaching. When the vehicle approaches head-on, aim directly at the most vulnerable spots. Do not fire until the target is in range.
It doesn't have to sound cool, but bring up the PIAT.
Take cover! Bring up the PIAT!
It's your job, Matt. You wrote the book about it. Oh,
There we go.
what a way. Shall I put the boys out of the way?
Yeah,
Because it's... Let's move that.
definitely getting a workout for this video.
Anti-tank weapons are not light.
So this is the PIAT, or Projector Infantry Anti-Tank. Sometimes people say Projectile Infantry Anti-Tank, but that's not quite right.
They're wrong.
The Australians called it the PITA, the Projector Infantry Tank Attack, which...
Much more aggressive.
Yeah, exactly. So essentially, it's a spigot-based weapon, which it's a little bit unusual in that there's nothing else really like it other than the Blacker Bombard, which is also in British service, and there's a couple of spigots used by the Japanese as well. And what that is, it's essentially a giant rod inside, which is dynamic in this case. So when the weapon is cocked, it's inside, a bomb is placed into the tray, and when the trigger is pulled, the spigot goes forward into the bomb tail, ignites a small propellant cartridge, which is in the base of the bomb, and that gas expansion from the propellant cartridge is what launches it off the spigot. Another common misconception with the PIAT is it's spring-powered, which it definitely isn't. So the action is spring-powered, much like a rifle.
Yeah, any small arm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what the spring does basically is not only does it power the action in that it sends the bolt forward, or the spigot forward, it also soaks up all that recoil, because you're firing a 2.5, 3 pound bomb with a propellant cartridge, and you're looking to get a range of about 300 yards with that bomb. So it's a considerable amount of recoil when you fire one of these. And one of the things that everyone talks about is that shoulder braking kind of recoil impulse. But there's accounts from guys that use both this and the boys that talk about this being a much more pleasant experience, because this is more of a push, whereas the boys was a bit of a kick.
And this is going to absorb some of that energy as well, because it's recocking itself.
Exactly.
It's not that problem of having to compress that spring every time. If it's fired properly, it's going to recock itself. So it's going to lose some of that energy, just not from the shot. You're just holding it in place.
Yeah, it's got a 12-pound spring. It's a very thick coil spring, and as long as you've got it in the shoulder nice and tight, then it should recock itself. If there's no issues with the bomb itself, when it's fired, it should recock. But obviously, if you don't, that's where your problems with the PIAT start to come in, because you have to recock it. And to compress that spring manually, you have to unhook unlatch the butt and then extend it outwards, and then that compresses the spring. And it's quite an effort to do that, especially if you're in contact, you're in action. But the capability that the PIAT provides is far and away much better than what the boys can at this point of the war. So the PIAT comes in 1943, which is just on the cusp of when we see it in the game, because it's Tunisia, and that's when it comes in. And then the most famous photograph of it in Tunisia is actually some small arms skull guys, doing a demo. And essentially, it's a really effective weapon.
Similar to the boys' anti-tank rifle, it was carried at platoon level. So in the platoon headquarters, so the platoon commander, signaller, 2-inch mortarman, and then there would be the PIAT team, which was 2 people. So whereas the boys could be used by a single person and had its stuff there, this needed 2 people really. The PIAT gunner carries it. These are just rifle straps, the rifle slings, so they can carry it on their back quite easily. But the PIAT gunner would be using it, deploying where he expects to find tanks. And then the number 2 would be carrying the PIAT bombs, like this. So they would have those in cardboard containers, is it?
3.
3.
Yeah.
3 in a set, isn't it? And then they look similar to the 2-inch mortars that have 6. So that's why.
Just a bit fatter.
Yeah, well, a fair bit fatter.
So this essentially is slid into the action, and the game does a decent job of showing that. They even show it sort of like locking into the 2 lugs here that hold the bomb in place. But it's a big step up, moving from the boys 5.5 round to what is essentially a shape charge. It's a heat round, high explosive anti-tank, in which a cone of explosive creates a molten jet into the actual armor and melts the armor, and that's what kind of penetrates rather than a kinetic projectile. But these prove really quite useful in a number of roles, because not only is it a good anti-tank weapon, but it also has a secondary role which they designed into it, or it kind of evolved into, in which it can be used as an indirect, almost like a mortar, a short-range mortar.
Yeah, so you've got this although very simple sight here, with just 3 holes in it, so you can just gauge the range. Those bits fold down. But on the top of it, you can see this white line, which can be used for very quick, simple range taking. But this foot comes out, as far as it's coming out,
there we go,
this far. You start to get that elevation. On the side here, you've got quite a complex, almost like it is a clinometer really, that you can adjust for high angle or low angle. And you can then take your range off that and fire it over so that the bomb drops on top of what you're aiming at. Probably stuff that isn't moving at that point. So say bunkers, pillboxes, emplacements and things like that. But that shape charge is going to do some work on them as well.
Yeah, I mean, they did trials looking at whether they were effective against bunkers, and they were deemed to be effective enough to actually be used in that role. They weren't as effective against earthworks, because obviously
it's just going to absorb, isn't it?
It completely absorbs it, and there wasn't an actual high explosive round developed for it.
One of the great little quotes from a 1945 publication that is a job analysis of the infantry. It's probably one of the best things the British Army the War Office wrote in the Second World War, but it actually uses an example of where these were used for line throwing across rivers as well. So it doesn't have to project a bomb all the time. You've got this spring. How do we throw something over this ravine? Let's use a PIAT.
Yeah, I mean that's fascinating because, again, it's a very versatile weapon, and there's numerous accounts of them being used in the mortar roll. There's accounts of them being used to what was at the time called mouse holing, where you blast a hole in a building when you're doing urban combat and you're fighting through an urban area. Line throwing, as you mentioned, and then one of the interesting things is there are actually photographs of guys propping them up on things to get even more elevation than the actual monopod provides. So they were actually a really well liked weapon. There's a common misconception that they were not very good, but the Canadian Army did after action questionnaires, surveys, and this was almost tied with the Bren in terms of they asked what weapons in the section and the platoon were good, and this was, they recognized this was a really versatile, good weapon.
So one of the things that I did a little while ago was looked at Victoria Cross citations, and it reminds us how you do have to be quite brave to use a PIAT.
Yeah.
You have to be a brave soldier to do many of the things that the infantry were doing, but PIATs to be effective have to be up close and almost in the way of a tank. Ideally you want to get to the side, but quite often to the side of armour is infantry, and you are infantry, so that's not going to be great. So you're going to get up close. And one of the things that I found in that study where there were 7 Victoria Crosses awarded that cite the PIAT in their use. And what's quite remarkable is most of the small arms related Victoria Crosses, it's about a 50-50 split as to whether they're posthumous or for a living recipient. In the case of the PIAT though, it's actually 6 out of those 7 were living recipients. They were incredibly brave and they succeeded, and they got their Victoria Cross for making significant impacts into the battle that was in front of them. So PIAT gunners certainly seem to be a different breed, particularly if they're effective.
Yeah, and it's worth noting as well that those 7 are just individuals that primarily actually use the PIAT. There's a number of other VCs that mention direction of use of PIAT, moving PIATs around and probably and using them as well. But then there's a whole glut of military medals and other gallantry decorations.
That top tier,
exactly.
But,
so there are dozens, if not hundreds, of citations surrounding PIAT use in action. So in game, the representation of the PIAT isn't bad at all, really. I've seen far worse. I have a video on my channel where I look at a load of different PIAT depictions in various games, and I think I actually rated them out of 5 PIAT bombs. So I give this one about 4. Okay. One thing that it doesn't have is that indirect fire line that we have on this one and that you mentioned earlier. So you can't use the PIAT in the game in that secondary indirect fire role, which is a shame. It'd be nice to add, but not many games bother because I think it's quite a complicated animation and dynamic to make a reality in game, for the developers.
And also, it sort of takes it away from being an anti-tank weapon, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So again, it's like that game balance thing all the time of we've got an anti-tank weapon, let's use it against tanks.
Yeah.
Otherwise, people will be using it against pillboxes.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, interestingly, in the game as well, the character fires from the shoulder. So with the boys, he gets down prone, fires prone, and then but with the it's entirely possible. Ganju Lama.
Are you sure?
Yeah, Ganju Lama apparently fired from the shoulder. So, when he was awarded his VC.
Okay.
So it's hefty. It's about 34 pounds, which is just a little bit lighter than the boys on paper.
Yeah.
You add a 3-pound bomb to it, so maybe overall, maybe not. But in the game, running and gunning, firing from the shoulder, which is possible. Apparently, similar in Arnhem, there was some firing from the shoulder.
One of the practical things about that is the bomb is not going to fall out before you start to think, oh, the bomb will just slide out the front, because there are grooves that key into the back of the bomb, so it's not going to fall out.
Yeah.
So in reality, okay, it'd be hard work.
There's a spring clip which fits onto the base of the actual bomb's tail, and there's a pair of guides that sits in. And the real reason for that is there's 2, because 1, you don't want it falling out when you're firing, and you want it to be aligned with the spigot when it comes through. Secondly, you want to be able to fire downwards as well from buildings, which
Yeah,
is
of
one of
course.
the things that the PIAT can do that Panzerfaust's bazookas can't do. They can't fire from enclosed spaces in the same way that you can with a...
Because we've got no backblast.
Exactly.
So we haven't got a rocket fire in. It's going to kick up dust because there is an element of explosion that happens in the front there to project it, but it's not going to have a backblast. So somebody can be behind you. You can lie directly behind it. And yeah, you can use it inside buildings.
You can.
Right.
The game does a good job representing that that boom, that blast from the propellant cartridge. Whereas I said earlier, the buoys, the recoil on it doesn't look to be about right. It looks a little bit anemic. Whereas with the PIAT animation, it looks pretty good. It is a considerable kick. There's a couple of other things in the game that are interesting. The character can only really look through the 70-yard aperture on the rear sight, which makes aiming off at a distance a little bit difficult. So you kind of have to hold above the target if you want to hit something further away. A nice sort of thing to note, because not only does it have the earlier pattern rear sight, but it also lacks the indirect fire painted line that we mentioned. But otherwise, the model in the game is pretty good, I think.
Good. There we go. That's a quick summary, a quick overview, perhaps not that quick, but an overview of the anti-tank weapons that were in the game. The PIAT remains in service with the British Army to the end of the Second World War, and that bomb remains effective, doesn't it, Matt?
Yeah, it's capable of penetrating any armour that the German forces fielded right up until the end of the war, in theory. You have to be in the right spot, to the rear of it, to the side of it, depending on what tank you're taking on. But it remains in service, as you say. There's evidence that they were taken to Korea in some number as well.
But also we're fighting a much bigger combined arms battle. So why, not say worry, but why would you put forward your PIAT gunner to within 50 yards of the enemy armour when you can call up 17-pounder anti-tank guns at a battalion level? You can use that massed artillery and stuff to defend yourself against tanks. So yeah, it stops development because basically we win the war, it ends. But it, as Matt says, it stays in service until we replace it. We replace it with what's a much more traditional and obvious, perhaps, bazooka. This is a 3.5-inch rocket launcher. This is a British-made example. This is what we replaced the PIAT with. It looks cumbersome and cranky, but actually this will break down into two parts.
It's also much lighter as well, isn't it?
Much lighter. So it can break down to two parts. They connect next to each other, and we can then change the warhead, the charge within it as well, to penetrate the armour as it develops into the 50s and 60s. Thanks for watching. I hope that's been useful and an understanding of these anti-armour weapons in the game. We'd really like to see your support and your comments below. So please do so. Please head over to our Patreon channel to support the association in carrying what it's doing, and look forward to our submachine gun video as we develop that and share it. It's full auto only.